First major test, talking Michigan football. We got Steve Deace on the line here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. You can catch Steve and his guests over at Michigan Podcast here on YouTube or on all the major audio platforms. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm good, Mark. How are you?
I am doing great and looking forward to week 4 of college football and some Big Ten play. Indiana, Ohio State didn't give us much of anything in terms of conference matchups, let alone Iowa and Rutgers a few weeks ago. But when you talk Michigan and Wisconsin, that gets my attention. Your Wolverines a 3.5-point underdog with the 1 bye week to get prepared. What has been the rhetoric out of Ann Arbor in regards to fixing some of the ills?
Not much rhetoric. They've been rather quiet. My own view is I kind of get the sense they're stunned, particularly offensively. The defense has been really good. In fact, Bill Connolly's advanced stats at ESPN has Michigan's defense number 1 right now in advanced stats. That's overrated, but the defense, Don Brown, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, like Ohio State last year, has been cash money since he's been at Michigan. So the defense is fine. Offensively, I think they're shell-shocked by some of what they've seen. I think it's pretty clear when you look at their preseason comments that they were expecting a lot more. So, this game on Saturday kind of comes down to, do you really believe offensively they can take some kind of giant leap in 1 bye week that they couldn't take for 8 months getting ready for the season? All right. So, it really comes down to that. Now they're going to get better offensively, more reps with a new system, a lot of talent. It's just a matter of, might they lose 2 or 3 games before they do and put themselves out of the race. But, this game looks a lot like last year's Wisconsin-Michigan game, but in reverse. Michigan was the team with the revenge motive. Michigan was the healthier team. Michigan was at home. Michigan was the team playing better at that point in time. So, every trend, every intangible is against Michigan here. And it's why since the preseason, in the season opener lines in the summertime, Michigan was like a 9-point favorite in this game. So a 12.5-point adjustment from the odds makers is indicative of where they have these teams power rated right now after their performance in the first 2 weeks. And Wisconsin's the last team left in the FBS that hasn't given up a point yet.
And generally coming from a team in Wisconsin that was coming off a near college football playoff appearance in 2017 that was considered better going into the season in 2018 than they were considered by most coming into 2019. Michigan right in that number 5 to 10 range by most analysts. Is the replacement of Shea Patterson, a quarterback, a real issue, a real consideration?
Ask me that question after this game. I think this is a big game. I think it's a big game for the trajectory of the program. I think it's a big game for this season. I think there's a lot riding on this. You have this morning, you have the Ann Arbor News writing a story. You'd never see the Columbus Dispatch write this story. You'd never see the Harrisburg Times in Pennsylvania write this, or the Lincoln Journal-Star, or the Tuscaloosa Herald. And it basically says Michigan's program is here to make revenue, not win championships. And it quotes boosters and alum and professors and administrators saying, hey, we're perfectly fine. Basically, it just says we're fine going 8-4, 9-3. They're making tons of money, and we're staying out of trouble off the field. You would never, for 2 reasons. One, the media in those campus towns would never write the story if it was actually true. That's just not the way that culture works when you're trying to cover a team. The other is all those schools would never even dare entertain that thought from the first place. So that's an amazing story that they have written this morning. And I think Jim Harbaugh really needs this win. And it's not because I think he's in danger of being fired or anything. It's the exact opposite. I think would be far more likely is he could just coach here and be 8-4, 9-3 ad nauseum, and the fan base there'd be a huge schism there. From people are like, what's the point of filling up the stadium to go to the Outback Bowl? But one way to avoid that, I like taking control of your own destiny. I don't like just, let me just sit back and let bad things happen to me. Do something about it. Even though they've got some injury issues, they're clearly the more talented team on Saturday by any objective metric. You cannot have Jack Cohn outplaying your 5-star quarterback. Go out there, actually play to your expectation level for once. The whole thing about Michigan, are we overrated, underrated? Hell, let's just try rated. All right? You've got a top 10 roster in the sport. Go out there and just play like it in a key setting as an underdog. Michigan hasn't won a game as an underdog since 2013. Right? And just do that. And then we don't have to have all of these what if scenario conversations.
Michigan has not won a game as an underdog since 2013. And so I've got to think that happens 2 to 3 times a year on average. Wow.
Yeah, they're 0-13. And the game they won in 2013, you'll remember this, that's the game where they had to come off the field with the field goal, miraculous field goal alignment. Apparently the Michigan State coaches didn't get that film from 2013 from Michigan. All right. That's the game where they had to pull off one of the all-time field goal alignments to force overtime. They were a slight underdog at Northwestern. That's the last time they won a game as an underdog. 0-13 since then.
So this Wisconsin team, they've not proven anything, but at least they've taken care of business against inferior opponents and looked very sharp. But based on the lack of elite talent and the type of scheme that they run on offense, they would seem to be tailor-made to playing into Michigan's hands.
That's exactly why I think this is a very important game. I mean, I can't even imagine what the narrative would be or how you'd push back. When you go up there, they're coming off a 5-loss season, and a lot of these are pretty much this is the same team Michigan had 300 yards rushing against last year with 4 new starters in the offensive line, and one of those guys is hurt and isn't going to play for Wisconsin this weekend. All right, so essentially last year's 3rd-string right tackle will be starting for Wisconsin in this game. You had over 300 yards rushing against these guys. You go up there because here's the thing. I know they threw for 400 yards against Central Michigan. We both know they're not throwing for 400 yards against Don Brown. All right. So if they win this game, it's going to be because they were the tougher, more physical, smarter football team. I mean, they played a brand of football that Michigan kind of made famous for decades here, right? In the Schembechler era. Boy, imagine going up there and losing to them for those reasons. That's going to be a terrible narrative. And that's why I think this is a really big game for the Wolverines.
Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast, joining us, talking Michigan football, a big game against Wisconsin, of course, 2 teams that are near the top of their divisions expected here in 2019. And we both know, Steve, that Vegas holds to its narrative. They have to be proven a particular team to be much better or worse than what they anticipated. The likes of an Ohio State can get a scare after an Iowa blowout loss, and they're still going to march out there against good teams and be 17, 20-point favorites. So something speaks to me in Wisconsin being a 3.5-point favorite against Michigan, especially since Wisconsin didn't have like an LSU non-conference game that they showed us anything in.
Well, what the line says, a common misnomer is that the line they create is to get an equal amount of action on both sides. That is not true. The opening line, if that was true, you'd never have an unranked team favored at home against a ranked team. And we see that all the time. The initial line is a handicap. It's based on power ratings, situations, etc. The reason the line moves from there is in order so that in the end, they do have an equal amount of action on both sides, so they don't lose. They don't care about the outcome, and they just cash the vig and make their money. But the initial line is not, let's come up with a line that gets an equal amount of action on Wisconsin and Michigan. The initial line is a handicap. And what that initial line tells me is they're unsure about the caliber of competition Wisconsin has played, but they were impressed. They are worried that one of these weeks, Michigan's going to put it together offensively and just steamroll somebody that matters. And they're worried about getting in front of that. I think they're worried about the talent discrepancy between the 2 teams and thinking maybe this is that week. And so what do? When you've got variables that you can't control and you can't calculate, you just put a cop-out 3-point line up there and just say, that's probably Wisconsin's home field advantage at noon Eastern. And if the game was played at 7 o'clock at night, it'd probably be Wisconsin for 4.5. And they'd say that's their base advantage in a home night game. I think that line represents their uncertainty about where these two teams are at right this particular moment. So the one constant is probably the home field advantage for Wisconsin, and that's the line.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We bring on the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation to talk college football. Analysis from myself. I'm ranking the conferences currently the worst of the Power Five, as you can imagine. I just released a few minutes ago, and the metrics speak to it very clearly. The running back situation we touched on after the 33 carry performance by Zach Charbonnet. Was there anything said by Jimmy to speak to that workload and what that could be going forward?
Yeah, they don't want to have to repeat that, but it's really going to come down to, are those guys better, the other guys better in pass pro than they were a week ago or 2 weeks ago? And I think they'd like to go with a situation like we saw against Middle Tennessee. Charbonnet gets 12 to 15 carries, maybe 20 total touches when you factor in carries and out of the backfield at the most. And then, Christian Turner, who's actually the fastest running back they have, he gets the next lion's share. And then, a True Wilson, depending on if he's healthy or not. But I think those other guys are going to dictate that. They're going to have to show that they can be trusted in those situations. Now, Wisconsin doesn't quite have the talent and depth at linebacker they've had in the past for this angling, attacking 3-4. It looks like they're going to start a true freshman at nose guard against us. The starter there looks like he's going to be out. But still, even when they're not at their peak, they're not rolling out, TJ Watts out of there. The alignment issues and the assignment issues and the communication issues that crowd can throw into that mix can lead to some blown assignments and some free rolls at the quarterback. So I think that's what they're concerned about is, everybody wants to open up the offense, and that's great. But if the running backs cannot be trusted to be that last line of defense for the quarterback to get the ball off, it doesn't really matter at that point.
Steve, I alluded to comparing conferences. When I look around the Big Ten, I see no performances that impress me. I see a couple results that are positive. Of course, Iowa winning at Iowa State is a solid win for the conference, but it was down to the wire. It wasn't an overwhelming performance. Maryland winning against Syracuse despite the orange. We'll see how the season plays out for them, but I see mid-lower tier teams winning that matchup going the favor of the Big Ten. Otherwise, I see a lot of negative results. In particular, Michigan State losing as a 15-point favorite at home against Arizona State for a second consecutive year, not mounting any type of substantial offense in that game. As you look around the conference, it's not building up for a conference that gets more respect than any outside of the SEC. I think that there will be a lot of considerations made, but for me, I have to rate it as a poor performance to date.
Third year in a row that this is going to be a league that lacks quality non-conference wins. Might be the third year in a row Iowa beating Iowa State's the best non-conference win in the league. Iowa beat Iowa State in 2017, 2018. Both those Iowa State teams ended up winning 8 games. Those were both the best non-conference wins for the Big Ten that year. Kind of depends on whether Michigan can beat Notre Dame, in late October, what Syracuse turns out to be. But right now, if Iowa State's at least as good as they have been the last couple of years, they're about an 8-win program. That might be by far the best non-conference victory that the league gets again, depending on how good Syracuse is and what Michigan does against Notre Dame. The Michigan State loss was a terrible loss. Mark, since Michigan State won the 2015 Big Ten championship, they're 21-20, Mark. And in 5 of their last 10 games, Michigan State has scored 7 points or less. In 4 of their last 6 games last season, they gave up one touchdown or less on defense, and they lost 3 of those games. So I don't really know what's going on there. And if you look at their roster, I think they're starting like 11 seniors, and their best defensive back, Josiah Scott, probably going to go pro after this season. I mean, this was kind of supposed to be the team that was maybe his last hurrah there. And he's been following their recruiting classes the last few years. They've always been a developmental program, but their recruiting base is nowhere near what it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So, and then the way they lose that game, and everybody's talking about, the 12 men on the field and then the leap over calls. Let me tell you where Michigan State lost that game. was on the last drive by Arizona State when they took the lead, and Michigan State called timeout twice to decide which defense to play on that, what they hoped would be a decisive fourth down. And after the second timeout, they come out in a 3-man alignment. Now, what is by far the strongest unit on the Michigan State team?
D-line.
Yep. And what do they play? A 4-3. By you doing that, you are preemptively diminishing the strength of your team. I mean, it reminds me of what Wisconsin was doing last year, where they took Jonathan Taylor off the field on third down. Why would you take your best player off the field on the most important down? I don't understand that. And even if you want to play a bit of a prevent and, play an NFL style, put my guys on the yard marker and say, keep everything ahead of you, fine. But keep the 4 best, maybe arguably the 4 best players in their entire program out of 85 are those defensive linemen. Why would you take any of, and after 2 timeouts, they ought to be fresh. Why would you take those guys out of the game on the most important play of the game? And you just kind of get the sense there that we're closer to the end of an era for a guy that's been a tremendous coach, no question about it. But you kind of get the sense we're getting closer to the end of an era there.
Yeah, I didn't think so necessarily. I thought that they had settled into an 8-4 type program. We've had this conversation a number of times and wouldn't have a real tough time of cycling back up to that 2010 to 15 standard. But it may be even worse than that if some programs like Indiana and Maryland maybe come around and become even bigger factors, and those aren't automatic wins in the future. All right, there's some play for Iowa possibly making a run at this thing. Now that they've cleared the non-conference hurdle, they do have the difficult out-of-division schedule to deal with, but how do you like the Hawkeyes?
Well, I thought going into the year, having worked media in Iowa, I've covered this team professionally for about 20 years in various capacities. I thought going in, this was easily the toughest road schedule they've had since I've covered the team. It might have been the toughest road schedule going into the season I can remember a Big Ten team ever having. But now you start looking at a couple of those games, I'd be really worried about Hunter Johnson if I was Northwestern. There is yet to be a moment where I thought, yeah, that's the guy that was rated higher than Tua Tagovailoa coming out of high school. I haven't seen that once. There's not been a point where you're like, wait, boy, there it is. When you put that together, not really. I'd be worried about that. I mean, this is not your average transfer. He was there all of last year. He didn't just come in the offseason. Maybe now Northwestern has Iowa's number, but, that road trip doesn't look as daunting as it did before the season. The Michigan trip doesn't look as daunting. I think it is just as possible. Michigan just finally it clicks against Wisconsin and they win by a couple of touchdowns and they kind of, we'll see all at the end of the year in the game. As it is, they lose that game, lose to Iowa at homecoming. Sometime around mid-October, late October, it finally starts to click. And maybe they do win those big games at the end of the year, but they can only get to 9-3 because of what happened early on. They're that much of an enigma offensively right now. And when we're going to play an Iowa team, they're going to be the same team every week. So if you're better than them, you'll beat them. But if you're an enigma yourself, they don't get out of their game plan. They're fine winning 13-10. They don't care. So I don't know, that road schedule, Wisconsin game looks harder than it did at the beginning of the year now. But in total, it doesn't quite look as tough to me now. Does the Nebraska game on the road look as hard to you as you thought it might have been in July? I don't think so. So I definitely think they're in the race for sure.
Steve Deace, Michigan podcast, breaking down the Big Ten and the nation. Couldn't get to anything else, but of course, Michigan, Wisconsin, if I'm watching one game, that's the game I'm watching on Saturday. So I definitely wanted to wring that one dry. So Steve Deace joining us from Michigan podcast. Appreciate the time as always, Steve. Know that you got a ton going on. So enjoy the game. I hope you can.
So do I, Mark. So do I. Thanks, man. Take care. Go Blue.